Part 1. The Incident. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Riverside County as Staff Sergeant David Thompson adjusted his dress uniform one final time. After 18 months deployed overseas, he was finally home. The crisp November air felt different here than the dusty heat he'd grown used to in the Middle East. Everything seemed smaller somehow, more peaceful. David had spent the morning at the Veterans Day ceremony downtown, where Mayor Collins had given him a special recognition for his service. 3 tours of duty, multiple commendations, and not a single black mark on his record. His chest displayed ribbons that told stories of courage under fire, of lives saved, of missions completed against impossible odds. But today all he wanted was to surprise his wife Kelly and their 8-year-old daughter Sophie at home. The gas station on Maple Street looked exactly the same as when he'd left. Same faded paint, same old signs advertising lottery tickets and cold drinks. David pulled his truck into the station, checking his phone for any messages from Kelly. She thought he wasn't coming home until next week. The surprise would be worth seeing the look on Sophie's face when Daddy walked through the door. As he filled up his tank, David noticed a few people staring. It wasn't unusual. The dress uniform always drew attention, especially in a small town like this. Most folks were respectful. Some even thanked him for his service. He nodded politely to an elderly man who gave him a thumbs up from across the parking lot. The gas pump clicked off at exactly $42. David secured the cap and headed inside to pay, grabbing a pack of Sophie's favorite gum on the way. The teenage cashier smiled when she saw his uniform. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said genuinely. "Thank you for saying that," David replied, handing over his credit card. "It means a lot." As he walked back to his truck, David felt that familiar sense of gratitude wash over him. This was what he fought for. These simple moments, these everyday interactions, the freedom for people to live their lives in peace. He started the engine and pulled out of the gas station, heading toward the neighborhood where he'd grown up. The radio played softly as he drove through familiar streets. Mrs. Patterson's house still had the same flower garden. The old oak tree where he used to climb as a kid still stood tall in the park. Everything felt frozen in time, a perfect snapshot of the America he remembered and protected. David was stopped at a red light when he noticed the police car pull up behind him. He glanced in his rearview mirror, seeing Officer Bradley Hendricks behind the wheel. David didn't recognize the face, but that wasn't surprising. The police force was small and people came and went. The light turned green and David continued driving, staying exactly at the speed limit like he always did. The police car stayed behind him for several blocks. David felt a slight tension building in his chest, but he pushed it away. He wasn't doing anything wrong. His registration was current, his license was valid, and he was driving responsibly. There was no reason for concern. When the red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind him, David felt confused more than worried. He pulled over immediately, parking carefully on a side street near the old community center. His hands remained visible on the steering wheel as he waited for the officer to approach. Officer Hendricks took his time getting out of the car. He was a large man with a permanent scowl, the kind of person who seemed to carry anger around like a heavy coat. As he walked toward David's truck, his hand rested casually on his weapon. "License and registration," Hendricks demanded without any greeting or explanation for the stop. "Good afternoon, officer," David said politely, keeping his voice calm and steady. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" "I'll ask the questions here," Hendricks snapped. "License and registration, now." David moved slowly and deliberately, announcing each action. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket." He pulled out his military ID along with his driver's license. "My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach over and get it." When Hendricks saw the military ID, his expression darkened further. "What's this supposed to be?" "I'm active duty Army, sir. Staff Sergeant David Thompson. I just returned from deployment overseas." "I don't care what you think you are," Hendricks said, examining the documents with obvious suspicion. "Step out of the vehicle." David felt his heart rate increase, but he remained calm. He'd been trained for high-stress situations, and he knew the importance of de-escalation. "Officer, I'm happy to comply, but could you please tell me what I've done wrong? I was driving the speed limit and obeying all traffic laws. Are you arguing with me?" Hendricks's voice rose dangerously. "I said get out of the truck." David slowly opened his door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible at all times. Several people across the street had stopped to watch. Mrs. Garcia from the corner store stood in her doorway, and a few teenagers had their phones out, though David couldn't tell if they were recording. "Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle," Hendricks ordered. "Officer, I'm wearing my dress uniform. I have no weapons, no contraband. I'm a decorated soldier returning from serving our country overseas." David's voice remained respectful but firm. "I'd like to know what law I've broken." Hendricks stepped closer and David could smell alcohol on his breath. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This officer had been drinking, and now he was looking for a confrontation. "You people always think you're better than everyone else," Hendricks muttered, just loud enough for David to hear. "Walking around in your costumes expecting special treatment." The racial slur that followed hit David harder than any enemy fire he'd faced overseas. In that moment, he realized this wasn't about traffic violations or procedure. This was about something much darker, much more dangerous. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," David said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I'm not looking for any special treatment. I just want to go home to my family." "Shut up and turn around," Hendricks shouted, grabbing David's shoulder roughly. David complied, placing his hands on his truck while his mind raced. He thought about Kelly, about Sophie waiting at home. He thought about his soldiers overseas who looked up to him, who counted on his leadership. He had to handle this correctly, had to be the example he'd always tried to be. Hendricks began searching him aggressively, his hands rough and invasive. "What else you got hidden? Drugs, weapons?" "Nothing, sir. Just my wallet, keys, and phone." The crowd across the street was growing larger. David could see more phones pointed in their direction. Part of him hoped they were recording, that there would be evidence of what was happening. Another part of him just wanted this to be over. "This uniform doesn't mean anything to me," Hendricks said, his voice filled with venom. "I know what you really are." David closed his eyes for a moment, drawing on every ounce of his military training. He'd faced enemy combatants who wanted to kill him, but this felt different. This felt personal in a way that military conflict never had. "Officer, I've served 3 tours overseas defending this country. I've never been arrested, never had so much as a speeding ticket. I'm asking you to please check my record." Hendricks spun David around violently. "I don't need to check anything. I can see exactly what kind of person you are." The situation was escalating beyond David's control. He could see it in Hendricks's eyes, a rage that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with hatred. David's training kicked in, the same instincts that had kept him alive in combat zones. "I'm going to step back and call your supervisor," David said calmly. "This has gone far enough. Don't you move!" Hendricks screamed, his hand moving to his weapon. David raised his hands higher, his heart pounding. "I'm not moving anywhere, officer." "I'm completely compliant." But Hendricks was beyond reason now. The alcohol, the racism, the anger that he'd been carrying for years. It all came together in this moment. He saw David not as a decorated soldier, not as a human being, but as a threat to everything he believed about the world. "You reached for something," Hendricks yelled, though David's hands had never moved from above his head. The first shot rang out like thunder in the quiet neighborhood. David felt the impact in his chest, a burning sensation that spread through his entire body. He stumbled backward, confused and disbelieving. "I didn't reach for anything," he gasped, looking down at the spreading red stain on his dress uniform. The second shot hit him before he could process what was happening. David fell to his knees, then onto his side, the pavement cold against his face. He could hear screaming from across the street, people shouting for someone to call an ambulance. As his vision blurred, David thought about Sophie's smile, about Kelly's laugh, about the soldiers he'd left behind overseas. He thought about the flag on his uniform, the same flag he'd sworn to defend with his life. He never imagined it would come to this, here on a quiet street in his hometown. Hendricks stood over him, his weapon still drawn, shouting into his radio about an armed suspect and an officer-involved shooting. But David could barely hear him now. The world was getting darker, quieter. Mrs. Garcia was the first to reach him, pressing her hands against his wounds while tears streamed down her face. "Hold on, son," she whispered. "Help is coming. Just hold on." The teenagers with the phones had captured it all. Within minutes, the footage. Part 2. The cover-up. Begins, Chief. Robert Mitchell's phone buzzed on his desk just as he was preparing to leave for his grandson's soccer game. The caller ID showed Hendrix's number, and Mitchell almost didn't answer. Bradley Hendrix had been nothing but trouble since the day he joined the force 2 years ago. Too aggressive, too quick to anger, and with complaints piling up in his file that Mitchell kept having to smooth over. "What now, Hendrix?" Mitchell answered, already feeling the headache forming behind his eyes. "Chief, there's been a situation. An officer-involved shooting." Mitchell dropped back into his chair. In 30 years of law enforcement in Riverside County, they'd only had 3 officer-involved shootings and none in the past decade. This was the kind of call that could destroy careers and end political futures. "Where are you?" "Corner of Maple and 3rd Street. "The suspect?" "He's down. Ambulance is on the way." Mitchell grabbed his keys and badge. "Don't say another word over the radio. I'm en route." The drive to the scene took 8 minutes, but it felt like hours. Mitchell's mind raced through possibilities, protocols, and damage control measures. Everything would depend on the circumstances, the evidence, and most importantly, how they managed the narrative. When he arrived, the street was already chaos. Ambulance crews were working frantically over someone on the ground. Crime scene tape was being strung up by Officer Janet Reynolds, one of his most reliable people. A crowd had gathered across the street, and Mitchell could see several people holding up cell phones. "Those phones recording?" he asked Reynolds as he ducked under the tape. "Started as soon as it happened, Chief. I tried to get them to move back, but it's a public street." Mitchell cursed under his breath. In the old days, they could control information. These days, with everyone carrying cameras, that was nearly impossible. He'd have to work with what they had. Hendrix stood near his patrol car, his face pale and sweaty. Mitchell had seen that look before on young officers after their first real trauma. But something felt different about this, something that made Mitchell's instincts scream warning signals. "Talk to me, Bradley. What happened here?" Hendrix's story came out in disjointed pieces. A routine traffic stop, a suspicious individual who became agitated, reaching for something that could have been a weapon. Fear for his life. Standard officer-involved shooting language that every cop learned in training. But Mitchell had been doing this too long to miss the inconsistencies. Hendrix couldn't explain why he'd pulled the suspect over in the first place. His timeline kept shifting. And there was something else. Something in his eyes that looked more like guilt than trauma. "Chief," Reynolds called out. "You need to see this." Mitchell walked over to where the victim lay. The paramedics had cut away the uniform to access the wounds, but Mitchell could still see the military insignia, the ribbons, the polished brass. This wasn't some random suspect. This was a soldier. Staff Sergeant David Thompson, Reynolds read from the military ID. Active duty, multiple deployments. Clean record, no warrants, no nothing. Mitchell felt his stomach drop. A decorated soldier shot during a traffic stop in their quiet town. This was going to be a nightmare of epic proportions. Federal investigators, media attention, civil rights groups, and everything he'd spent his career trying to avoid. "Get me his full background immediately," Mitchell ordered, "and find out if he has family here." As the ambulance pulled away with sirens blaring, Mitchell surveyed the scene more carefully. 2 shell casings on the ground. No weapon visible anywhere near where Thompson had fallen. Witnesses across the street who'd clearly seen everything. "Chief Mitchell," a woman approached the crime scene tape. It was Mrs. Garcia from the corner store. Her face streaked with tears and blood on her hands from trying to help. That boy didn't do nothing wrong. He was polite, respectful. Officer Hendrix just started yelling at him for no reason. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but we need to conduct our investigation properly," Mitchell replied, though his heart was sinking with every word she spoke. "I saw the whole thing from my doorway. That soldier had his hands up the whole time. He never reached for nothing." Other witnesses began approaching, all telling similar stories. A routine stop that escalated without provocation. A calm, respectful soldier who followed every instruction. An officer who seemed angry from the moment he made contact. Mitchell pulled Hendrix aside, away from the growing crowd. "Bradley, I need you to think very carefully about what you tell me next. These people are saying things that don't match your report." Hendrix's face flushed red. "Chief, you know how these people stick together. They'll say anything to make us look bad." The casual racism in that statement told Mitchell everything he needed to know. This wasn't a justified shooting. This was a disaster waiting to explode. "Go back to the station immediately," Mitchell ordered. Don't talk to anyone. Don't write any reports until I get back. And for God's sake, don't say a word to the media. As Hendricks drove away, Mitchell turned his attention to damage control. The first priority was controlling the narrative before it got away from them completely. Reynolds, I need you to canvass for any security cameras in the area. Traffic cams, business surveillance, anything that might have caught this. Already on it, Chief. The community center has cameras, but they're old and might not have captured much. The gas station where Thompson stopped has cameras too. Get me that footage immediately. And I mean immediately. Mitchell spent the next hour interviewing witnesses, and their stories remained consistent. Staff Sergeant David Thompson had done nothing to provoke the shooting. He'd been calm, respectful, and compliant throughout the encounter. Several people mentioned that Hendricks seemed agitated and aggressive from the beginning. The body camera footage should have settled everything. But when Mitchell asked Reynolds about it, her face went pale. Chief, there's a problem with Hendricks's body cam. He says it malfunctioned during the encounter. Malfunctioned how? Claims it stopped recording right before the shooting started. Some kind of technical glitch. Mitchell felt the walls closing in. A decorated soldier shot under questionable circumstances, multiple witnesses contradicting the officer's story, and conveniently missing body camera footage. This was shaping up to be the kind of scandal that could end not just Hendricks's career, but Mitchell's as well. His phone rang. District Attorney Patricia Wells. Bob, what the hell happened out there? I'm getting calls from the mayor, the county commissioners, and someone from the military. It's complicated, Pat. Officer-involved shooting, but the circumstances are unclear. Unclear how. Either your officer was justified or he wasn't. Mitchell chose his words carefully. The suspect was a military member, active duty. Clean record. Witnesses are saying things that don't quite align with the officer's preliminary statement. There was a long pause on the other end. Wells was up for re-election next year, and the last thing she needed was a controversial case involving police brutality and a military victim. Bob, I need this handled quietly and carefully. Can you make this go away? I'm working on it, Pat. But we've got witness statements, potential video evidence, and a lot of attention already. This might not be something we can just make disappear. Find a way. I can't afford to have this blow up during election season. After ending the call, Mitchell walked back to his car, his mind racing through options. 30 years of service, 20 as chief, and he'd never faced anything like this. He'd covered for bad officers before. Excessive force complaints, inappropriate conduct, minor corruption. But this was different. This involved a soldier, real witnesses, and the kind of attention that could destroy everything he'd built. Back at the station, Mitchell found Hendricks in the break room, staring at a cup of coffee with shaking hands. The smell of alcohol was still faint but noticeable. Bradley, have you been drinking today? Had a beer with lunch, Chief, just one. Nothing that would affect my judgment. Another lie. Mitchell could tell from the smell that it had been more than one beer. Probably several, which explained the poor decision-making and aggressive behavior. Here's what's going to happen, Mitchell said, sitting down across from Hendricks. You're going to write your report exactly as I tell you. We're going to emphasize the suspect's erratic behavior, his failure to comply with commands, and your reasonable fear for your safety. But Chief, some of that's not— I don't want to hear it. You screwed up, Bradley, bad. And now we all have to deal with the consequences. You can either help me minimize the damage or you can face federal charges and prison time. Your choice, Hendricks nodded reluctantly. What about the witnesses? Leave that to me. I've been handling difficult situations since before you were born. Over the next several hours, Mitchell worked methodically to build a defensive narrative. He contacted the gas station owner about their security footage, suggesting it might be better for everyone if the cameras had technical issues that day. He spoke with potential witnesses, subtly intimidating some and discrediting others. Mrs. Garcia proved to be the biggest challenge. Her story never wavered, and she'd gotten close enough to render aid to Thompson to see exactly what had happened. Mrs. Garcia, I understand you're upset about what you saw today, Mitchell said when he visited her store that evening. Part 3. Military Intervention. Colonel Lisa Rodriguez was reviewing deployment schedules at her Pentagon office when her aide knocked on the door. Lieutenant Colonel James Park entered with the kind of expression that meant trouble was coming. Ma'am, we have a situation developing in Riverside County. One of our soldiers has been shot by local police. Rodriguez looked up from her paperwork. Details? Staff Sergeant David Thompson, 82nd Airborne Division. 3 combat deployments, exemplary record. Shot twice during what appears to be a routine traffic stop. He's in critical condition at County General Hospital. Rodriguez had been handling military affairs for 15 years, and she'd learned to read between the lines. When a decorated soldier got shot by police during a routine traffic stop, it usually meant something had gone very wrong. What's the local police department saying? Standard line. Suspect failed to comply, officer feared for his safety. But there are witnesses saying otherwise, and social media is already picking up the story. Rodriguez opened her laptop and quickly pulled up Thompson's service record. What she saw made her stomach tighten. This wasn't some troublemaker or discipline problem. Thompson was exactly the kind of soldier the Army held up as an example. Brave, dedicated, professional. "Get me General Morrison on the phone immediately," she ordered. "And pull together everything we have on Thompson. Service record, commendations, disciplinary actions, medical history, everything." While Park made the calls, Rodriguez continued reading Thompson's file. Bronze Star for valor in Afghanistan. Purple Heart for wounds sustained while saving 3 fellow soldiers. Commendations from every commanding officer he'd ever served under. This was a man who'd repeatedly risked his life for his country, and now he was fighting for that life in a hospital because of a small-town cop. General Morrison answered on the second ring. "Rodriguez, what's this about one of our soldiers?" "Sir, we have a decorated combat veteran shot by police under questionable circumstances. The local department is already spinning their narrative, but witness accounts suggest this was unjustified. Send me everything you have. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Rodriguez had worked with General Morrison for 5 years, and she'd never seen him as angry as when he walked into her office 28 minutes later. The 4-star general read through Thompson's file with growing fury, occasionally muttering words that would have impressed the saltiest sergeant. "This soldier has served with distinction in some of the most dangerous places on Earth," Morrison said finally. "He's saved American lives, completed every mission assigned to him, and never once brought shame on the uniform. And some small-town cop shoots him during a traffic stop?" "Yes, sir. And the local authorities are already trying to control the narrative." Morrison stood up, his jaw set in determination. "Not on my watch. Rodriguez, I want you to assemble a team. Full military investigation under the Military Justice Act, provisions for protecting service members from civilian misconduct." "Sir, the local authorities won't appreciate federal interference." "I don't give a damn what they appreciate. When someone shoots one of our soldiers without justification, it becomes our business. Get me a team of investigators, legal experts, and forensic specialists. We leave for Riverside County in 2 hours." Rodriguez had never seen the military move so fast. Within 90 minutes, a full investigative team was assembled. Major Patricia Washington, the Army's top criminal investigator, Captain Robert Chen, a forensics expert who'd worked crime scenes from Iraq to Afghanistan, and Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Turner, a JAG officer who specialized in civil rights cases. The flight to Riverside County gave Morrison time to plan their approach. He'd dealt with local law enforcement before, and he knew they'd resist federal involvement. But he also knew the law, and when it came to protecting military personnel, the federal government had significant authority. "Our priority is the truth," Morrison told his team as they prepared to land. "I don't care about politics, careers, or public relations. Staff Sergeant Thompson deserves nothing less than a complete and honest investigation." The convoy of black SUVs that rolled into Riverside County at 4 p.m. caused quite a stir. Morrison had deliberately chosen to make a visible statement. This wasn't a quiet inquiry. It was a federal investigation with the full backing of the Pentagon. Chief Mitchell was waiting at police headquarters, clearly uncomfortable. He'd dealt with federal oversight before, but never anything this high level or this fast-moving. "General Morrison, I appreciate your concern for your soldier, but we have the situation well in hand," Mitchell began as soon as Morrison walked through the door. "Chief Mitchell, let me be clear about something," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in uniform. "When one of my soldiers is shot under questionable circumstances, it stops being just your situation. We're here to conduct our own investigation, and we expect full cooperation." "Of course, General, but I should point out that our investigation shows this was a justified shooting. The suspect failed to comply with lawful orders and posed a threat to the officer." Major Washington stepped forward with a tablet in her hand. "Chief, we've already reviewed the social media footage taken by witnesses. It shows Staff Sergeant Thompson with his hands raised throughout the encounter. How do you reconcile that with your officer's report? Mitchell's face flushed. Witness accounts can be unreliable, especially in high-stress situations. Multiple witnesses, multiple angles of video, all telling the same story, Captain Chen added. That's not unreliable testimony, that's evidence. Morrison could see Mitchell scrambling for a response. Chief, we'll need to interview Officer Hendricks immediately, along with access to all physical evidence, police reports, and any video footage from body cameras or security systems. The body camera malfunctioned during the incident, Mitchell said quickly. Malfunctioned how? Lieutenant Colonel Turner asked, pulling out a notepad. Technical glitch. Equipment failure. These things happen. Morrison exchanged glances with his team. In 30 years of military service, he'd seen every excuse, every cover-up attempt, every bureaucratic dodge. This had all the hallmarks of a department trying to hide something. Chief, let me explain how this is going to work, Morrison said, his voice taking on the tone he'd used to address hostile foreign officials. We have federal jurisdiction to investigate crimes against military personnel. We can do this cooperatively, or we can do it with federal marshals and court orders. Your choice. Mitchell realized he was dealing with people who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. What exactly do you need? Everything. Every report, every piece of evidence, every witness statement. And we want to interview Hendricks within the hour. He's been traumatized by the shooting. Maybe we should wait. Chief Mitchell, Washington interrupted. We've interviewed soldiers who've been through actual combat trauma. I think we can handle a police officer who discharged his weapon. The next hour was revealing in ways Mitchell hadn't expected. The military investigators worked with precision and efficiency that made the local police department look amateur by comparison. They immediately identified inconsistencies in the police reports, gaps in the evidence collection, and witnesses who hadn't been properly interviewed. When Hendricks finally arrived for his interview, he was visibly nervous. Morrison observed from behind one-way glass as Washington conducted the questioning. Officer Hendricks, can you walk us through the events leading up to the shooting? Hendricks repeated the same story he'd told Mitchell, but Washington was trained to spot deception. She'd interrogated enemy combatants and corrupt officials. A small-town cop with a guilty conscience was easy to read. You stated that Staff Sergeant Thompson reached for something that you perceived as a weapon. Can you describe exactly what you saw? It happened very fast. He made a sudden movement toward his waistband. According to witness statements and video evidence, the staff sergeant's hands were visible and raised throughout the encounter. How do you explain this discrepancy? Hendricks shifted uncomfortably. Like I said, it happened fast. Things look different from different angles. Washington leaned forward. Officer Hendricks, are you aware that making false statements to federal investigators is a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison? The color drained from Hendricks's face. I told you what happened. What you've told us doesn't match the physical evidence or witness testimony. Would you like to reconsider your statement? In the observation room, Morrison watched Hendricks begin to crack under professional questioning. This wasn't the aggressive intimidation the local department might use. This was skilled interrogation designed to get to the truth. Meanwhile, Captain Chen was conducting his own investigation of the crime scene. What he found contradicted almost everything in the police report. The shell casings were positioned in a way that suggested Thompson was stationary and non-threatening when shot. There was no evidence of any struggle or aggressive movement. General, Chen reported back, the physical evidence is clear. Thompson was standing still, probably with his hands raised when he was shot. The first bullet hit him in the chest, the second as he was falling. There's no indication he posed any threat to the officer. Part 4. The Truth Emerges, Captain. Robert Chen had seen plenty of crime scenes during his 15 years in military forensics, but there was something particularly frustrating about this one. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion, yet the local police department continued to maintain their false narrative. Major Washington, Chen called out as he finished his detailed examination of Maple Street. You need to see what I found. Washington walked over to where Chen was crouched near a small puddle of dried blood. This was where Staff Sergeant David Thompson had fallen, and the story the blood spatter told was very different from Officer Hendricks's report. Look at the angle of the blood drops, Chen explained, using a laser pointer to highlight the evidence. They're consistent with someone standing upright when the first shot hit. No defensive wounds, no signs of struggle, no indication of any aggressive movement. What about the shell casings? Chen led her to 2 small yellow markers he'd placed on the pavement. Both casings landed here about 8 feet from where Thompson was standing. The angle suggests Hendricks was stationary when he fired, not backing away from a perceived threat. Washington nodded grimly. She'd worked enough crime scenes to know what this meant, so Thompson was standing still, probably with his hands up, when Hendricks decided to shoot him. That's exactly what the evidence shows. And there's something else. I found scuff marks on the pavement that suggest Thompson actually stepped backward when he saw the gun, trying to create distance. Classic de-escalation behavior. While Chen continued his forensic analysis, Major Washington turned her attention to the most crucial piece of missing evidence, the body camera footage that had supposedly malfunctioned. She'd dealt with enough corrupt officials to recognize a cover-up when she saw one. Lieutenant Chen, she called to the young computer specialist General Morrison, had flown in from Fort Gordon. Any luck with that body camera? Lieutenant Amy Chen, no relation to the forensics captain, looked up from her laptop with a satisfied expression. Ma'am, whoever tried to delete this footage didn't know what they were dealing with. Military-grade data recovery is a bit more sophisticated than civilian police IT. You found something? I found everything. The camera never malfunctioned. Someone manually stopped the recording, then tried to wipe the memory card, but they left digital fingerprints all over the deletion process. Washington felt her pulse quicken. Can you recover the footage? Already did. And ma'am, it's exactly what the witnesses said it was. The recovered footage was damning beyond any reasonable doubt. It showed the entire encounter from Hendricks's perspective, including his aggressive approach, his racist comments, and David Thompson's calm, respectful compliance throughout the incident. Most disturbing was what the audio revealed. Thompson's voice was steady and polite even as Hendricks became increasingly hostile. When Hendricks ordered him out of the vehicle, Thompson asked respectfully what he had done wrong. When Hendricks began searching him roughly, Thompson remained perfectly still. The most chilling moment came right before the shooting. Thompson, with his hands clearly raised, had said, "Officer, I'm a soldier. I've served 3 tours overseas. I just want to go home to my family." Hendricks's response was captured with crystal clarity. "I don't care what you think you are." Then 2 gunshots, and David Thompson's life hanging in the balance. "Get this to General Morrison immediately," Washington ordered, "and make copies of everything. If this footage disappears again, I want backups in 3 different locations." While the technical team worked on the digital evidence, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Turner was conducting her own investigation into Officer Hendricks's background. What she discovered painted a picture of a man who had no business wearing a police uniform. "General Morrison," Turner reported during their evening briefing, "Hendricks has a documented history of racist behavior going back to his academy training. His instructors noted troubling attitudes toward minorities, but passed him anyway. What about his time on the force? 7 excessive force complaints in 2 years, all involving minorities. 3 formal complaints to Internal Affairs, all dismissed without investigation. And I found something interesting at the VA clinic." Turner pulled out a thick file folder. "Hendricks has been visiting the local Veterans Affairs clinic regularly, but not as a patient. Multiple staff members report that he harasses minority veterans, questioning their service records and making racist comments." Morrison's jaw tightened. "A police officer harassing veterans at a medical facility? It gets worse, sir. I spoke with Dr. Patricia Williams, the clinic director. She says they've filed multiple complaints with the police department about Hendricks's behavior, but Chief Mitchell always dismissed them. Do we have documentation? Every complaint, every incident report, every witness statement." Dr. Williams kept meticulous records because she knew something like this would eventually happen. The picture emerging from Turner's investigation was of a police department that had systematically ignored warning signs about a dangerous officer. Hendricks's racism wasn't a secret. It was an open problem that the department had chosen to ignore. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, David Thompson was slowly emerging from his medically induced coma. His wife Kelly had barely left his side, and their 8-year-old daughter Sophie had been asking when Daddy was coming home. "David? Can you hear me?" Kelly whispered as his eyes began to flutter open. David's first conscious thought was confusion. The last thing he remembered was standing next to his truck, trying to understand why a police officer was so angry with him. Now he was in a hospital bed, his chest wrapped in bandages and machines beeping around him. Kelly, his voice was hoarse and weak. "I'm here, baby. You're going to be okay. You're in the hospital, but you're going to be fine." "What happened?" "I remember." The police officer seemed upset about something. Kelly fought back tears. "How do you tell your husband that he was shot by a racist cop for no reason other than the color of his skin? How do you explain that the country he'd served so faithfully had failed to protect him on his own hometown street?" "There was an incident, David. But there are good people working to make it right. The military sent investigators, and they're going to find the truth." General Morrison arrived at the hospital that evening to speak with Thompson personally. As he entered the room, he saw a man who embodied everything the military stood for: courage, honor, service. The contrast with Officer Hendricks couldn't have been starker. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, I'm General Morrison. How are you feeling?" "Sir, I'm confused more than anything. I keep trying to remember what I did wrong during that traffic stop." Morrison sat down beside the bed. "Sergeant, you didn't do anything wrong." "Nothing at all. Our investigation has shown that Officer Hendricks acted without justification, and he's going to face consequences for what he did to you." "Sir, I don't understand." "I was respectful. I followed all his instructions. I told him I was active duty military." "I know you did, son. I've seen the footage. You conducted yourself exactly as a soldier should, with honor and professionalism. The failure was entirely on the part of Officer Hendricks." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "General, what does this mean for my career? Will this affect my ability to serve?" Morrison was struck by the question. Here was a man who'd been shot by a police officer for no reason, and his first concern was whether it would hurt his military service. "Sergeant, this incident will have no negative impact on your career whatsoever. If anything, the way you handled yourself under extreme stress reflects well on your training and character. The Army is proud to have you." Over the next few days, as Thompson continued to recover, the military investigation uncovered even more evidence of corruption and cover-up. They found deleted emails, intimidated witnesses, and a pattern of misconduct that went to the very top of the local police department. Dr. Williams, from the VA clinic, came forward with additional information that painted an even darker picture of Hendricks's behavior. "He would come to our clinic and harass our patients," she told Major Washington during a recorded interview. "African-American veterans, Hispanic veterans, anyone who wasn't white. He'd question their service records, accuse them of lying about their injuries, make racist comments about their capabilities as soldiers." "Did you report this behavior?" "Multiple times. I called Chief Mitchell personally after each incident. I sent written complaints. I even contacted the county sheriff's office. Nothing ever happened." "How did the veterans react to this harassment?" Dr. Williams's voice grew emotional. "These are men and women who served their country, some with severe PTSD, some with traumatic injuries. They would come to us for help, and this police officer would re-traumatize them with his racist abuse. Some stopped coming for treatment altogether." The investigation also revealed that the gas station's security footage had been deliberately destroyed on Chief Mitchell's orders. However, the community center across the street had cameras that captured the entire incident from a different angle. The gas station owner, Frank Rodriguez, came forward voluntarily, Captain Chen reported. He said Chief Mitchell pressured him to delete his security footage, but he felt guilty about covering up what happened to a soldier. Part 5. Justice and Accountability. 6 weeks after the shooting, federal prosecutors arrived in Riverside County with a level of authority that Chief Mitchell had never encountered. Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos walked into the courthouse carrying files that would dismantle the entire cover-up and bring justice to Staff Sergeant David Thompson. "Your Honor," Santos addressed Federal Judge William Hayes during the preliminary hearing. "The evidence in this case reveals not just a single act of police brutality, but a systematic pattern of civil rights violations and obstruction of justice that demands federal intervention." Officer Bradley Hendricks sat at the defendant's table, no longer wearing his police uniform. The man who had seemed so powerful and intimidating during the traffic stop now looked small and defeated. His attorney, Public Defender Robert Clark, knew they were facing an impossible case. The defendant, Officer Hendricks, shot an unarmed, decorated combat veteran during what should have been a routine traffic stop. Santos continued. The evidence shows this was not a split-second decision based on perceived threat, but a deliberate act motivated by racial hatred. Judge Hayes reviewed the evidence package that General Morrison's team had compiled: body camera footage, forensic analysis, witness statements, and a documented history of racist behavior. It painted a picture so clear that even Hendrix's own attorney had advised him to consider a plea deal. Mr. Clark, how does your client plead to the charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, attempted murder, and filing false police reports? Clark stood reluctantly. Not guilty, Your Honor. It was a formality. Everyone in the courtroom knew that with the evidence against him, Hendrix was facing decades in federal prison. The charges against Chief Mitchell came 2 days later. Federal agents arrested him at his home while his neighbors watched in shock. The man who had controlled law enforcement in Riverside County for 2 decades was now facing his own reckoning. Obstruction of justice, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and tampering with evidence. Agent Patricia Williams read as she placed handcuffs on Mitchell's wrists. You have the right to remain silent. Mitchell's wife stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Their grandson, Tommy, the one whose soccer game Mitchell had missed to cover up the shooting, watched from an upstairs window as his grandfather was led away in handcuffs. The federal investigation had revealed the full scope of the corruption. District Attorney Wells, who had been more concerned with her re-election than justice, found herself under investigation for conspiracy to obstruct justice. The entire power structure of Riverside County was collapsing under the weight of federal scrutiny. But the most important moment came when David Thompson finally returned home from the hospital. His 8-year-old daughter Sophie ran into his arms carefully, mindful of his still healing wounds. Daddy, are you okay? Mommy said a bad police officer hurt you. David knelt down to Sophie's level, choosing his words carefully. I'm going to be fine, sweetheart. And you know what? There are lots of good police officers who protect people like us. This was just one bad person who made very wrong choices. Kelly watched from the doorway, marveling at her husband's grace even after everything he'd been through. David refused to let this experience turn him bitter or teach his daughter to hate law enforcement. He remained the same principled man she'd married, committed to being the example their daughter needed. General Morrison visited the Thompson family that weekend, bringing with him news that would change David's life. Sergeant Thompson, the Secretary of Defense has decided to award you the Soldier's Medal for your exemplary conduct during the incident. Your composure under extreme stress and your representation of military values in a crisis situation reflect the highest traditions of the Army. David was quiet for a moment. Sir, I was just trying to get home to my family. I didn't do anything heroic. Son, heroism isn't always about charging into battle. Sometimes it's about maintaining your dignity and values when someone is trying to strip them away from you. You showed the entire country what a real soldier looks like. The medal ceremony took place at the Pentagon, with David's family in attendance. As General Morrison pinned the decoration to his chest, David thought about all the young soldiers who had sent him messages of support during his recovery. Thank you for showing us how to act with honor even when others don't, one private had written. You made us all proud to wear the uniform. The trial of Officer Hendrix became a national sensation. The courtroom was packed every day with veterans, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens who wanted to see justice served. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. The body camera footage played in court showed exactly what had happened: a decorated soldier being shot for no reason other than the color of his skin. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Assistant U.S. Attorney Santos said during her closing argument, Staff Sergeant Thompson did everything right. He was polite, respectful, and compliant. He identified himself as active military. He posed no threat whatsoever. Officer Hendrix shot him because of hate. Pure and simple. David testified on the 4th day of the trial, walking into the courtroom in his dress uniform with his head held high. He looked directly at Hendrix as he was sworn in, showing no fear or anger, just the quiet dignity that had carried him through combat in this ordeal. Staff Sergeant Thompson, Santos began, can you tell the jury what was going through your mind during the traffic stop? Ma'am, I was thinking about my training. Military personnel are taught to de-escalate situations, to remain calm under pressure, and to represent our service with honor. I was also thinking about my daughter and how I wanted to get home to surprise her. At any point, did you feel threatened by Officer Hendrix? Yes, ma'am. When I could smell alcohol on his breath and heard him making racist comments, I realized this wasn't a normal traffic stop. But I also knew that my best chance of getting home safely was to remain calm and compliant. Did you ever reach for a weapon or make any threatening gestures? No, ma'am. I kept my hands visible at all times and followed every instruction I was given. I even announced my movements before making them, just like we're taught in the military when dealing with nervous allies overseas. The defense had no effective cross-examination. How do you attack the credibility of a decorated war hero who had video evidence supporting his every word? Dr. Patricia Williams from the VA clinic testified about Hendrix's pattern of harassing minority veterans. Mrs. Garcia described what she witnessed from across the street. The forensic evidence was presented by Captain Chen, whose military precision left no room for doubt about what had happened. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Hendrix's own former partner, Officer Janet Reynolds, who had finally found the courage to speak out. I worked with Officer Hendrix for 18 months, Reynolds testified. During that time, I witnessed multiple instances of racist behavior, excessive force against minorities, and inappropriate comments about veterans of color. Did you report this behavior? I tried to address it with Hendrix directly first, but he dismissed my concerns. When I brought it to Chief Mitchell's attention, he told me to mind my own business and focus on doing my job. Why are you testifying now? Reynolds looked directly at David Thompson in the gallery. Because I took an oath to protect and serve, and I failed in that duty when I didn't do more to stop Officer Hendrix. Sergeant Thompson deserves justice, and the community deserves to know the truth. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, the courtroom erupted in applause. David Thompson sat quietly holding Kelly's hand, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. Judge Hayes sentenced Hendrix to 25 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for the middle-aged officer. During the sentencing hearing, he offered David the chance to address the court. Your Honor, David said, standing in his uniform, I want to say something to Officer Hendrix directly. He turned to face the man who had nearly killed him. Sir, I forgive you, not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying hatred would make me less than the soldier and the man I want to be. I hope you use your time in prison to understand the damage that racism causes, and maybe find a way to make amends. Hendrix broke down in tears, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done and the character of the man he had tried to destroy. Chief Mitchell received 15 years for his role in the cover-up, while District Attorney Wells was forced to resign in disgrace and faced her own federal charges. The systemic changes that followed were even more significant than the individual prosecutions. The Department of Defense established new protocols for investigating crimes against military personnel by civilian law enforcement. Local police departments across the country implemented mandatory training on interacting with veterans and active duty service members. Riverside County hired a new police chief, Dr. James Washington, a former military police officer with a doctorate in criminal justice and a commitment to reform. His first act was to establish a civilian oversight board and implement body cameras for all officers.